Alright, so we're going to do chapter, 13. So if you just words, if you just checked out chapter 12, hopefully that wasn't too garbage. Again, please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. But aside from that, we're going to jump into chapter 13. So, actually, let's do this. Let's look at the syllabus kind of together. In case you have not, remind me later, in case you have not checked the syllabus already, I forgot to do this in the redone chapter 12 version. Again, the original is on is through the link on the PowerPoint slide. I updated, this stuff is just kind of preliminary, but I upgraded the grading scale and the course schedule. So I kind of took out, again, the presentations for Career Day, as you can see here. Took those out. It's just the papers. You still have your online quizzes. You still have your thought papers. Sources are due via email, right, because we got a social distance. And I mentioned here March 12th, everything is after COVID-19. So that's kind of your marker of this was original stuff. Whoa. And then after this line is the new dates and times. Does that make sense? If it does not, again, please shoot me an email with any questions, comments, or concerns. So, moving back to the PowerPoint slides. So, based on that, your quiz number 4 over chapters 11, 12, and 13 is going to be coming up on April 7th. And then thought paper number 3 is going to also be due on April 7th at the usual time of 11 a.m. And you're turning that online, so that shouldn't make too much of a difference from what we were doing before. Alright, so as you can see, here is the original YouTube link, but this one we're doing right now with the better audio, I'm going to add that under here. Okay? So, today's a not so fun topic, right? So we talk about social institutions and why those are very important to how we understand families in the context of the world that we live in. But nevertheless, things don't always turn out as we plan, right? Things can go awry, and sometimes we succumb to stress, and sometimes there is violence and abuse in these marriages and families. So again, because this is a rough topic and this is an online lecture, take it in chunks if you need to. Take care of yourself. With all of the weird, crazy stuff that's going on in the world today, the last thing I want to do is add more stress to your plate. So if you need to take care of yourself and take this lecture in chunks, or you want to just read the book, whatever it is, do what you need to do to take care of yourself, because we're going to talk about some tough stuff today. So here we go. All right. So let's just talk about stress first, right? First off, we're going to look at the question on the bottom. Is all stress negative? Is all stress negative? We should know that it's a no, right? That's incorrect. Not all stress is negative. When you go to the gym, that's positive stress. You are putting your body under stress, and it's benefiting from that stress. When you come to class, or when you used to go to class, right? You were putting your brain under stress. That was good stress. But of course, there's going to be some negative stress as well. And when we think about it in the context of the family, stress is the imbalance between the demands of the family and the family's ability to meet those demands. Right? Makes sense. Similar to kind of a social exchange theory, kind of what do you have available and what does this thing cost? Now, this stress can be real or imagined, right? So a real stressor might be, you are going to get your house foreclosed on if you do not pay the bills, right? That is a very real stress. And I don't mean real, I do not mean real as in valid, as legitimate. I mean real as in almost like tangible, right? You will physically be kicked out of your house if you do not pay your bills. But there's also imagined stress. That might be these more interpersonal stressors based around like fear or anxiety, right? Again, not that isn't valid, because it is, but imagined as in it's not very tangible, right? So be thinking about what are some other stressors that may cause this real or imagined stress. And with that stressor, if it becomes great enough, can it lead to a crisis? This unstable condition where there is a lack of sufficient resources to manage the situation. And we're going to talk about that in a second. And of course, how do you cope with this crisis, right? How do you manage and confront that stress? Do you just binge watch Netflix? Do you sleep all day? Right? Those are not very good coping mechanisms, but how do you cope with this stress? So this is going to be the topic of your next thought paper. And this is the ABCX model. Now this is a event, situation, plus resources, plus perception, and how does that affect your degree of stress? So your event or situation could be, let's keep riding this foreclosure example. So your event or situation is your home is going to be foreclosed on. Right? That is your event. Your resources are, pretty straightforward. Do you have the money to pay your bill or else you will get foreclosed on? Your perception, however, that's kind of like your mindset. Right? Now this may feel silly, it may not, I don't know, it depends per person, but oftentimes people like to think the event or the situation and the resources, those are the only two that matter. Well, it doesn't matter what my perception is because yada yada yada, because my perception isn't going to change how much money I have, blah 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 blah. Okay, that's fair. However, your perception, if you have a negative perception or you just have like a bad mindset, right, you're kind of a negative Nancy about everything, that may make your degree of stress higher than it has to be. Right? If you maintain a positive attitude or you're calm and rational about things, right? Like, again, I'm making generalizations, but you get what I mean. If your perception is different, maybe you have a low degree of stress even though the event or situation is very dire. Right? But nevertheless, if all of these things add up, it can get to a point where there's this crack, there's this fault line where your stress becomes so great it goes into that crisis mode. And when it goes into that crisis mode, right, this stuff kind of goes out the window. Your resources, event or situation, perception, kind of goes out the window because your stress is now to the point where it's, it is just, it's so rough and, it's doing its own thing. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. If it doesn't, let me know with any questions. So some ways or some things that can cause this hugely significant amount of stress can be violence or abuse. Right? And again, not very fun stuff we're talking about. When people talk about family violence, it's the same as when they're talking about domestic violence. Right? Family, we usually understand as sharing some kind of household together. Not always. But we recognize in this context that domestic violence, we usually are talking about family violence as well. Or family violence as well as domestic violence. In regards to race, socioeconomic status, and gender, it's tough to say because all three of these are influenced by violence and abuse and influence violence and abuse. So it may change based on race. It may change on its socioeconomic status. However, I'm not quite positive on where the research lies with both of those. I would consult the textbook that I apologize for not having in front of me, but double check the textbook. Maybe that does answer those questions. However, I do know that gender, right, there is a huge amount of gender disparities between men and women, if we think about this in a dichotomous view, right, a very binary view of 1-2, man, woman. Men are disproportionately the abuser, and women are disproportionately the victims of that abuse, right? The victims or survivors of that abuse, if that's what you choose to use to describe those folks. Violence and abuse can have short-term and long-term effects, right? What is a physical short-term effect? Right, a short-term effect that's physical could be a broken wrist, right? Just, a broken bone, right? And people may think like, whoa, like that's pretty intense. Yeah, but your broken bone should heal. Like, granted, over 6-8 weeks, but it should heal, right? A long-term effect is maybe some kind of permanent scarring. Right, that's a long-term effect that it healed, but maybe there was something that happened that you can tell there was always, you can always tell something happened. Psychological, right, short-term, right, can be loneliness, depression, anxiety in the short term. It can also be depression and anxiety in the long term. Right, that that deep-seated trauma from something can have incredibly long effects on someone. Same thing with emotional, right? The emotional effects of having violence committed against you, or you even committing the violence against somebody else, and then of course being subject to abuse can have incredibly significant emotional effects. Now, this is what I kind of really want you to take away from this, is this cycle of violence, or you can also say, right, because we're talking about violence and abuse, you can also call it the cycle of abuse. And now, in this, there's this first stage, right? We can see that here. This is the first stage, and we call it the onset of tension. Right, so this tension is building, and this tension can be verbal, emotional, and it can last weeks, days, or years. Right, it can last a long time. Right, you can build tension over 15 years because you were married to somebody and you had 3 kids together. Right, and that tension just slowly built up, and that person became more verbally harsh, right, more emotionally distant. And then all of a sudden, we enter into the second stage, and this is the battering. This is the actual act of violence, right? This is the abuse. Now, say over that 15-year span of time, right, the abuse, the violence happens, and that can happen at any period or any time. It can happen after 2 days. It can happen after 20 years, right? Or maybe you had 10 good years and 10 not so good years, right? And it happened over those after that 10 years of building of tension, right? But it is the actual act of violence, and maybe even the act of violence lasts over 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Right? Even the abuse itself can happen over a long period of time, right? So this any period, any time. Now this is where it gets tricky, right? So third stage is the apology, right? Remorse, forgiveness, as you can see in the top right corner. How do we understand this? It often starts with the person... Sorry about my laptop. With the person who committed the violence or the abuse feels guilty, right? They recognize what they did was wrong, and they're extremely apologetic. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. You know I would never do that. That's so unlike me. That's not, that's not who I am. It'll never happen again. Right? We hear these words, but yet, even through these words, right, some of us may take those to heart, some of them may not, but the cyclical nature of this continues because the victim or survivor forgives. Right here, this is a half circle, right? This is not complete. But the remorse and the forgiveness, the cycle continues because that victim forgives the person and no true retribution is had for the actual abuse, right? No true remorse is settled, no justice is really had for this abuse. The victim simply forgives and we quote unquote move on, but yet we enter back into this cycle. Now again, just kind of like chapter 12, there's these clips, right? We are going to watch one here, but there are these clips. I encourage you to watch these on your own time. They are good for perspective. So why do they stay? Right? It's easy for somebody, even for many of us who have never been in a situation like this, to simply say, you know what, oh, it's just, why would the victim ever forgive that person, right? Like just leave, right? Like that's a bad situation for you. Get out of there. And even the social exchange theory would say, your costs are outweighing your benefits, you should just leave. But as we know, it's not that simple, right? As we mentioned, the abuser is apologetic, right? But maybe not even just the abuser is apologetic, but the person who suffered that abuse, right, that survivor, that victim survivor, buys into that apology, right? And they say, oh, you know what? Okay, I'll give you a second chance. Right? The abuser is pleading like, oh, I won't ever do it again, right? Give me a second chance. Then we have love, right? That's so hard to figure out. I mean, again, say, you've been married to this person for 15 years and you have 3 kids. Where do you draw the line? Right? Like, what is too much? What is, where is that line? What will you take versus what won't you take? Will you only forgive so many times? Is it once is enough? Like, what is it? Again, where do you draw the line if you love that person? Fear, right? Could they find you? Can you survive on your own? Right? A lot of people stay because if, again, you've been married to this person for 15 years, I'm going to keep using that example because I think it's a clear and concise one. If you've been married to somebody for 15 years, right, and your entire life is wrapped up in this person, you may have a lot of fear about leaving because you know that they could find you, right? They know all the places you go. They know where you hang out. They know all of your resources, right? They know who you would look for help. They know who you would turn to. Could you survive on your own? Maybe they threaten you to stay, right? And if you threaten to leave, will they hurt you even more, right? That happens a ton too. You can't leave me. If you try to leave me, this will just get worse, right? Just accept my apology and let's move on. Similar to the fear of could they find you, are you even able to leave, right? Do you have the resources to leave? Many folks don't. Again, if you've been, say you are a woman that has been staying at home, living, like raising 3 kids, and your husband has become abusive, right? You do not work. You have no actual money to your name, right? Your husband has the money, right? The house is in a shared name, so you can't like kick them off the lease or the mortgage or whatever. You have no money to leave. Your life is tied up with them. How do you leave? You have no resources to leave. And then there's this learned helplessness, right? Now this is again back to that cycle. You've gotten caught up in this cycle that the violence or the abuse has become your normal. That it's happened so often or, whatever, that it's become normal. You've gotten caught up in this cycle. Oh, that's just what they do. Oh yeah, you know what? Yeah, when he drinks, he just he gets a little upset sometimes. So we'll get to female victims in a second, right? But it is important to recognize the male victims as well, right? So again, gender disparities are very, very real. And the majority of folks who are victim survivors are women, right? The majority of those folks are women. And men are the ones who more often commit the violence and abuse than women. However, male victims are still able to be abused, right? And we're going to come back to these questions in a second, but I want to pull up this clip because it's a very powerful clip.
A new campaign is being launched today to raise awareness about male victims of domestic abuse. Tom Parmenter has been hearing one man's story.
In the mirror, Ian McNichol looks back at a man who was once broken, physically, mentally, and almost totally.
She was incredibly violent. I'll give you 3 or 4 examples. She placed lit cigarettes up my nostrils and forced me to go to sleep with those cigarettes still in my nose. She held my eyes open while she sprayed bleach into them. She assaulted me with a steam iron. She placed it on my left lower arm, on my upper right shoulder and in the middle of my shoulder blades. She boiled a kettle and poured it over my groin, and then whilst I was stuck to a leather sofa writhing in agony, she reboiled that kettle and re-poured it over my groin. And I'd got to the point where I was so mentally ground down, I lost almost 25% of my body weight. I have 2 permanent indentations in my left shoulder where I was attacked with a hammer with such ferocity that the handle of the hammer actually broke.
His former partner is now serving 18 years in prison.
Her justification was that I didn't tell her often enough that I loved her and I didn't instigate the physical side of the relationship. That was her justification for the violence, that I'd made her feel unattractive.
Ian is now slowly moving on with rebuilding his body and his life. He believes a tip-off to the police from an anonymous neighbour genuinely saved his life.
A lot of people will just not quite understand how it can happen, how you can't stand up to that kind of abuse.
Sure. Well, of course, as a victim, for me it's a gender-neutral crime. What actually happens is that your feelings... I loved my partner.
So I want you to really pay attention to what he's saying. He just said, I loved my partner. Even though she did all of that stuff, he loved his partner.
Those feelings get abused. It's wrong for a man to hit a woman. Violence of any description is wrong, so it wouldn't have solved it.
This guy even says it's wrong for a man to hit a woman, right? As it is for a woman to hit a man. So he's thinking the violence, if I committed violence back to her, that wouldn't have solved anything. Right? I mean, I believe that if you need to defend yourself, you defend yourself. Right? But that's my personal belief, that if you need to defend yourself, you do that. Right? But, nevertheless, his words are powerful.
I can't say why she committed the level of violence that she did. But the fact is for men that the other additional difficulties that they may not be believed if they come forward. So there's a challenge there. But all victims should find the strength to confide in someone because help is out there. I know that from my own experience and proof of that.
And as with any form of domestic abuse, deciding to find that help is often the hardest step. Tom Parmenter, Sky News.
All right. So what was that last little bit he said? Sometimes as a man, there are additional difficulties that they may not be believed. Right? Why might that be? Again, if we think back to gender norms, right, sex roles, all that stuff, the man is usually expected to be what? Right? Be the tough guy, be the care provider, right? The guy who brings home the food and brings home the money, and he's the protector. Right? So he can't be a victim of abuse. Men are supposed to be strong and right, they're supposed to be in charge, and if you're being abused, then that must mean you're not strong, right? You're not taking care of anything, right? So many men might feel trivialized for even thinking about coming forward with their abuse. It's a very real thing that happens to a lot of men, and there's a lot of folks out there doing research that not only speculate the actual amount of folks who have been in abusive relationships, both men and women, that the numbers are really not, simply the numbers aren't accurate, that there are more men that we know about and there are more women that we know about, right? So research is still developing on the impact of men, right, or the impact of abuse in men. So for female victims, right, as we mentioned, the majority of folks who are victim survivors of domestic violence, right, and abuse are female. Right, but there's an interesting phenomena that again applies to females, but really in general, is this family sexual abuse bit. That if you are a victim survivor of sexual abuse within the family, you are more likely to experience intimate partner violence when you're older. And we've talked about this in previous classes of a theoretical explanation of why this might be. And we'll even talk about it in a couple slides here, but we'll chat about it now, about intergenerational transmission. Right? We talked about this in regards to divorce, that if something happens to you, right, or if something happened to your parents and you witness it or you experience it, then it's the theory poses that you kind of embody that, you internalize that, and you almost, whether you can consciously, break free of this thought or not, you almost like subconsciously think that is the norm. That's normal. Right? So if you experience abuse as a child, you're more likely to have or to experience intimate partner violence when you're older. But even then, witnesses of intimate partner violence as children, so if you're a child and you witness intimate partner violence, you're actually more at risk than children who are actual victims. Again, intergenerational transmission. That's just one possibility, that's one explanation, right? But we'll roll with it. Say you're growing up and you see your mom abusing your dad, right? Your mom hits your dad all the time. And you're 8, right? So you don't necessarily have the mental faculties, right? You don't have the presence of mind to be able to, break down institutional systems and emotions and cause and effect and yada yada yada. Like you don't have the mental whereabouts to be able to do that. So you see this thing happening, and it frightens you, it scares you, whatever, but you see it. And it's hard for you to process it. So then, for example, maybe you get older and you are married, and now your wife, right? If you have a wife, for in this context, your wife starts to hit you, right? There's this idea that because that happened, or you saw it as a kid, you almost accepted it as the norm. So then when it happens to you as an adult, you simply think or recognize subconsciously, oh, well, this happened to my parents, I guess it's happening to me. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, let me know. Then there's this next point, right? We have wife rape. And I apologize for the R word. It's a hard word, but it's important to be able to say in this context. Wife rape is the idea that even if you are married, that one married partner has the almost ownership, sexual ownership over the other person. And that even if you're married, right, or when you are married and you want to have sex with the person you are married to, even if they say no, you are allowed to have sex, or you are allowed to force sex onto that person because you're married. Because you are married, you're allowed to force sex, right? You are allowed to initiate sex regardless of that person's want. Some people still debate whether it is rape or not. As you can tell, this is very blunt. It is. It certainly is. Some say it depends on the situation. It does not depend on the situation. Some say forced sex is okay. No. No, no. No, 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 no. No, no, no. No. No, no. If a person does not give you their consent, whether you are married, whether you are dating, whether you don't even know the person, if the person does not give you consent, it is not okay. It is sexual assault, right? You have to ask for that consent. And then, when they say yes, regardless of if you are married, or you are dating, or you don't even know the person, only after they say yes are you then allowed to do the thing. Only after they say yes. And if they change their mind, they change their mind. Everyone is allowed to change their mind. So it does not matter if you are married. It is wrong. Okay. In regards to same-sex couples, right, we've had a theme all semester that's trying to debunk that LGBTQ plus persons, right, same-sex couples are these like different people, right? No, they're just people, right? Yes, they experience discrimination, right, unlike many other folks, right, and and because of that, they have to live life certain ways. Right, they don't have certain privileges that a lot of other folks do, but nevertheless, many gay and lesbian victims, right, trans victims, all of that, experience similar rates and types of violence similar to heterosexual couples or individuals. As the man said, again, violence is violence, abuse is abuse. Yes, there are the gender disparities that men are often the people committing that abuse, but abuse is abuse. As mentioned in the previous slide, many abusers and victims have some kind of history of abuse. And then again, it's with sexual assault, rape specifically, it is about power and control, right? That is the main focus. It's not actually about sex. It is about power and control. Now there are some severity predictors that can influence how intense this how intense this violence and abuse is. Dependency is one, right? So think about being very codependent. If your life is completely dependent on somebody else, that leaves you in a very vulnerable position. And with that vulnerability can come abuse. Jealousy should make sense, and then of course substance abuse. Whether that be, prescription drugs, alcohol, other recreational drugs, right? Substance abuse can certainly affect how that abuse happens. In regards to siblings, right? Abuse does not just happen to adults. It does not just happen to people who are dating in college, right? Abuse and violence can happen to, again, anyone. So when we think of how abuse happens for siblings, between siblings, it's often physically and emotionally centered. So it's not necessarily psychological. It's not necessarily based on trying to manipulate somebody else's love for you. It's often about physical, like dominance, right? Some kind of physical attribute, or there's some kind of intense emotion attached to it. Some factors that may influence this physicality and emotionality is parental instability, right? If you're in a household and you have another sibling and the parents' lives are unstable, or their own relationship is unstable, well, they are the parents, right? So if they are unstable, that instability is going to affect you as well. Maybe there's favoritism. And I'm not necessarily talking about everybody loves the youngest. Like, that's not the kind of favoritism I'm talking about. I'm talking about there is so much favoritism towards one child that the other child is actively neglected because so much favoritism is placed on the other sibling. And again, this can, or not again, but this can then correlate in transition and bleed into inequality in household fairness. Right? One kid brings home a failed test. Parents say, "Oh, you're a smart kid. You had a tough test. Try next time." The other kid fails a test and they get, grounded for a week. They get all their stuff taken away and they get, physically reprimanded. Right? So that's very clearly inequality in household fairness. Other factors, right? Socioeconomic status. So if we think about that parental instability, if parents are working a ton and there's that lack of supervision, right? And parents are just never around and siblings have to take care of each other, that dependency, that codependency, that vulnerability, that may lead to abuse or violence. Of course, your personality is going to be a factor in learned behavior. If one child learns that violence got them what they wanted, then they're going to learn, I guess I'm just going to do that again. I want this new thing. Violence worked last time. I'm going to do that again. So what are some various theories about not just sibling abuse, right? Not just intimate partner violence, but if you, or I shouldn't say if you, but let me rephrase this. How do we explain childhood abuse? How does it happen? What are its effects? Right? How do we explain childhood abuse? So there are various theories. Social learning theory. If you ever watch some Netflix documentaries, right, about serial killers or like TV shows, this is probably what they're usually thinking, right? Social learning theory, that the person who did future abuse learned from their abuser, right? One kid was abused as a child, so when they grew up, they then abused others, or they committed some act of violence against others because that's what they learned from when they were a child. There's social cognition theory, right? So our cognitive thoughts, our thinking about our social environment, That's where we think that our situation is not that bad. That, oh, I'm being like my parent is abusing me, but at least I go to school, I have friends, I have clothes, I have food to eat. Right? It can't really be that bad, right? Some other kids have it worse. I don't have it that bad, right? So we are supposedly being rational about our situation. We are cognitively thinking about our social situation and comparing it to others. Then there's family systems theory. Again, as we chatted about in previous classes, there is this intergenerational transmission, right? Generation to generation. Say, for example, your father was abused by his father, right? So your grandpa abused your father. Well, your father, similar to social learning theory, learned it from his father, and so then your father does it to you, and you learn from your father, and you potentially do it to your kid, right? It's almost like a thing, an emblem. It is a behavior passed down between generations. And then trauma theory is very expansive, but nevertheless, it's simply, at its core, it's trying to understand how is trauma handled. So if you were abused as a child, trauma theory is kind of trying to get at the heart of, do you unpack that trauma? Do you go to therapy? Do you go to counseling? Do you work out those issues? Or do you stuff it away? Right? Do you pretend it never happened? Do you try to live life as you normally can? Right? That your eventual development will depend or be influenced by how you handle your trauma. So, kind of flipping all the way to the other side of things, we have siblings, we have intimate partner violence. Abuse and violence can happen to older folk as well. It can be physical, emotional, sexual. It's not often psychological. It's primarily these three, but it, of course, can be psychological as well. If you think about many older folk, again, they are in many vulnerable states. They're very dependent on somebody else. And that person who does the abuse is often withholding care or freedom as a weapon. So if we think about a institutionalized setting in that next bullet point, abuse could happen in a facilitated setting, right? In institutionalized setting where a elderly home like care provider does not allow somebody to have any social time or allow any visitors or miss their medication or something. They do something or they withhold that care, freedom as a weapon, for them to cooperate with something, right? That's how they commit their abuse. Is they recognize that vulnerability and they exploit it. However, it's usually not in an institutionalized setting because we've figured out enough safeguards for that. So when elder abuse happens, it's usually the person is related to the victim. It's a grandparent who lives close by and needs extra help at home. And some other child, right, some adult, grown adult, goes over to help mom or dad who's elderly and frail, and something happens, right? They're generally related to that victim. Again, victims tend to be females, rely on that abuser for financial support, that vulnerability, that codependency. And so many of them, because of their age, right, or their physical abilities, are unable to defend or remove themselves. All right, the last slide. I hate this slide. It's important. It's super, super important. But I always groan at this slide because if abuse happens to you, it's not your fault, right? People can be meanies to each other, right? But when somebody else steps over that line and commits abuse to you, violence to you, that is not your fault, right? Oh, jeez, is somebody drilling outside? Hopefully y'all don't hear that. I think you can. Hold on, I'm going to close the window. Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, so that's not your fault. All right. So if you are in an abusive situation, again, not your fault. But here are some ways to consider how you may protect yourself. Right? So there's this idea of having a safety plan. Research safe places to go in the community. Know who is safe that you can talk to. What is an assignment that I had y'all do that may relate to this? That was supposed to be thought paper number 2, right? Is finding these resources in the community that allow you some kind of option to go to if something is happening. Right? Know who is safe to talk to. The Title IX office, Ombudsman's office, student conduct, right? Maybe if you are at work, right? If this abuse is happening at work or it's happening to you at home, but you trust people at work to help you, right? Maybe you need to tell the appropriate people. Maybe they can be on your side, help you out. Get support. Obviously, this can be difficult, but seek it any way you can, just like the video of the man. Sometimes seeking support is the hardest part. If you want to leave, right, if that's where your headspace is at, that you're trying to get out of there, try to create a plan. Right? Try to put some things in place safely that allow you to execute some kind of plan when that day comes. Now, again, this bullet point, it's important, but it always gives me a weird feeling. But you are under no obligation to do this, right? You got to look out for numero uno, number 1. You got to look out for yourself. But if you are so inclined, you can urge the abuser to get help. Again, if you've been married to somebody for 15 years and you genuinely love this person and you don't want to leave, but you recognize this bad thing is happening, right? Maybe that is where you're at, that you're trying to get help for this person. Right? There are so many different factors in a situation like this that, I can't quite possibly explain every single type of situation. But I'm positive there are situations out there where folks do want to stay, right? They do care about that person. They love that person and they want to urge that person to get help because of whatever reason, right? And then last but not least, get help from professionals, right? Again, you as a student, you have Title IX, right? You have these other places to support you. And that can be difficult, again, to reach out to them. But say Title IX, for example, they are anonymous, right? They're confidential, right? If you go to them, no one will ever know that you went to them unless you said something. All right. So that's it. All right. So that was the redo of Chapter 13. Again, it was a tough one. Thank you for sticking with it. Just like last time, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please reach out to me. Let me know. Please do that survey. Both surveys, the one from the department to see if you're okay. Please do my kind of like midterm evaluation pre-coronavirus. Hang in there. If you have questions on the papers, whatever, right? Please email me. I'm trying to be as available as I can to you all. Hang in there. Wash your hands. Practice your social distancing. And I'll see you next time.